and also in private practice. The committee is myself as supervisor, Marco Polo. Second reader is Garth Norbrotten, and our program rep is Leila Farah, who I will now hand over the control of the mic to.
Okay, thank you very much, Marco. I'm delighted to be here today and to welcome you all, and particularly to Nona Arezehgar for her final thesis presentation called Corporeality, a Haptic Space. So Nona, you have 20 minutes to present, and then we'll have a discussion and some questions. So if you're ready to go, we'll be delighted to hear you.
The hegemony of vision and the suppression of other sensory realms has led to an architecture distance from the human body. Undoubtedly, vision has the ability to receive the greatest amount of information from our surroundings. Hence, it has been considered as primary to our perception. However, its interconnection with other bodily sensations is essential to perceive the totality of space. This connection also compensates for the limitations of sight. The purpose of this critique is not to demonize visuality. It is to consider the rhizomatic and interconnected nature of haptic perception of space. Merleau-Ponty argues that the lived body is a vehicle of being in the world and does not happen in space as an object. It has its spatiality. He believes that our motor intentional knowledge of the world provides an infinite number of possibilities for engagement. For James Gibson, the purpose of perception is generating and controlling actions through affordances that exist in our environment. Palassma related what he described as the inhumanity of the contemporary architecture to the neglect of the body. Stephen Hall believed that an awareness of one's unique existence in space is essential in developing perception, and therefore the importance of the body became his inspiration. Schusterman's theory of soma-aesthetics criticizes the modern culture where humans have moved away from body awareness. He refers to the lived experience of the dwellers in space as a crucial dimension of architecture. In his theory, he introduces the idea of correcting the functional performance of the senses through improving somatic awareness as opposed to rejecting the body due to its deceptions. Approaching corporeality results in haptic spaces that enhance or suppress our bodily experience of spatial qualities, while sharpening our visual experience. This thesis will explore the spatial interconnections between the somatosensory system, including the tactile sense, proprioception, kinesthesia, vestibular sense, thermoception, and nociception, with haptic spatial perception, vision, and consequently bodily actions. These actions include being in motion or motionless. Bodily movements based on Gibson can be categorized into two types, performatory and exploratory. Corporeal architecture is an approach to architecture that emphasizes the human body as the concept for the design and spatial articulation. Somatosensory system is composed of receptors and processing centers to produce haptic perception. Haptic perception is bodily perception that focuses on the exploration of space through the somatosensory system. Proprioception is the sense of position of one's body and where body parts are in relation to one another. Kinesthesia is the sense of movement. Vestibular sense is the sense of orientation and balance. Thermoception is the sense of temperature, and nociception is the sense of pain. Pain is the conscious experience of a feeling of unpleasantness, both physically and mentally. Therefore, any spatial quality that is exaggerated to the extreme can present an unpleasant experience and therefore be considered as painful. The importance of haptic senses is neglected in architecture, constituting missed opportunities. Therefore, the thesis intends to answer the following question: what are some possibilities embedded within haptic space to create a richer architectural experience by simultaneously impacting our bodily experience of spatial qualities and sharpening our visual experience. To explore these possibilities, the concepts of attraction and aversion, parallactic space, and perilous space are used. Spatial events can create attraction or aversion based on one's perception of them. We do not just act in space, we act upon it. Attractions and aversions can be the tangible properties of space, such as geometrical qualities, including form, composition, and scale, surface qualities, and material qualities. There also exist intangible qualities of the environment, such as light and temperature. The concept of parallax as an element in architectural composition focuses on the connection between kinesthesia and vision. It may be applied to space to achieve dynamism by constantly changing the subject-object relationship through motion. The impact of parallax is exaggerated and the experience is multiplied when the axis of movement moves from horizontal to oblique or vertical. Therefore, spatial elements that allow for circulation, including ramps and staircases, are the transitional spaces that allow parallax to create a multisensory experience. Spatial qualities activate bodily senses, and the more exaggerated these qualities are, the more intense the experience will be. One way to exaggerate these qualities is to go against their routines in space. This allows for taking risks and encountering accidental opportunities. Based on a speculative analysis of these concepts in architectural case studies, I summarized the contrasting spatial qualities that can be used in haptic space in the library of spatial binaries. Some of these binaries include solid, threshold, even, uneven, flat, sloped, rigid, flexible, and continuous and interrupted. The effect of these qualities is exaggerated when they come in binaries next to their contrasting quality. In this matrix, I compared the impact of these spatial binaries on vision and somatosensory system. It can be concluded that vision is the primary sense that we use to perceive space, followed by kinesthesia and proprioception. Then, I analyzed the three concepts based on the impact of the relevant spatial qualities on the bodily senses. The numerical values are the sum of the impacted senses of all spatial binaries on each concept, under each concept. The result shows that vision and kinesthesia are common factors in all of these three concepts. Aside from these two, attractions and aversion mostly impact thermoception, parallactic space mostly impacts proprioception, and perilous space mostly impacts the vestibular sense. The thesis project will focus on creating spatial opportunities that offer multiple narratives for movement and numerous experiential opportunities, as opposed to the typical homogeneous single journey that exists in many buildings. This is made possible by providing parallactic and perilous qualities, as well as attractions and aversions. The spatial experience can be categorized into static and kinetic. Some experiences do not need movement to affect haptic and visual perception, whereas others do. Haptic space becomes its own hybrid typology, allowing for static and kinetic perception to coexist by dedicating the use of static spaces to static perception and transitional spaces to kinetic perception, or the opposite, depending on how the body understands space. In this case, when static and kinetic perception happen simultaneously, movement becomes a way to get to rest, or rest becomes a way to get to move. The proposed massing consists of a series of 3 by 3 by 3 meter cubes, which are placed around a 6 by 6 meter core. And the exploration of massing was based on achieving the maximum number of spatial opportunities within the form in terms of geometric qualities. The massing is composed of cubes that are considered to be static forms due to their equality of dimensions, while a complex overall massing depicts the dynamic nature of haptic perception. The solid white exterior contrasting the hapticity of the interior further emphasizes this dichotomy. The program is suppressed, and the project is purely an experiential machine to allow for the exploration of haptic space. The core provides access to all spaces in an expeditious and conventional way, as well as maximizing visual connection between different spaces. On the other hand, the subject can enter the cubes that provide unknown spatial opportunities, questioning conventional experiences, and changing the architecture of distraction to an architecture of conscious awareness. The following sequence of images are captured as experienced by a subject and are seen through her eyes. Upon entering, the subject is faced with 3 options for movement. She pauses to make a decision, and then gradually ascends. As the eyes see the interior through the openings, it is convinced that the body is moving in the right path. After a bit of walking, she finds herself descending again, reaching her initial location. Followed by a short pause, she takes the second path. There's an ambiguous state between indoor and outdoor as the visitor slowly transitions between inside and outside. The exterior ramp becomes interior as it ascends. She finds herself inside the building, but then is taken outside again. The constant change between inside and outside fluctuates the temperature. The warmth, softness, and circular geometry of the pine handrail, in contrast to the cold and hard texture of concrete, invites touch as the body tries to navigate in space. After the twists and turns, the ramp finally enters the building and leads to the large celebratory foyer. Looking around the foyer, she finds the next set of stairs in the corner. This interrupted and slow movement from the entrance to the foyer and then to the first level requires a constant change of direction at every landing, and therefore constantly disorients the body. The feeling of expansiveness motivates the eye to look up to the sky. She interprets the repetition of stairs and landings as levels with similar layouts. Later, she decides to continue. She feels a transition between the cold and expansive atrium to the warm and compressed brick room. She senses the heat radiating from the thick brick surfaces and suddenly feels warm. The hands reach out to feel the texture of the brick. Looking through the opening, the reflection of water on the floor acts as a visual attraction, and it invites the explorer to move towards it. When leaving the brick room, the subject finds herself in another expansive space. However, the space seems more spacious since it was experienced directly following a very compressed room. Looking up, the eyes meet the water through a glass floor and become curious to navigate there. With mirrored surfaces on all sides, the visual perception is expanded, and the visitor becomes extremely conscious of positioning herself and navigating through space. She raises the arms forward to find the way, and as her hands touch the mirrored walls, the feeling of expansiveness changes to one of compression. Taking the exterior ramp, the body can reach the next level from the mirrored room. As the visitor enters the flexible space, she can interpret the room based on her need and comfort. This flexibility provokes a sense of ambiguity by questioning the boundaries. The flexible facade can be used as a way to bring in light and provide views of the outside, or can be used as soft sitting areas. The carpeted cubes can be interpreted as sitting surfaces, soft flooring to walk on, tables, or partitions. As the subject reaches the next level, the curved wall interrupted by a series of columns grabs the attention. The explorer becomes curious enough to try to find her way there. However, the path to get there is not easy. One can walk outside and walk back in from in between the columns, or crawl under the ramp to get there. To move to the next level, she is faced with multiple options, each engaging the body at a very different rhythm of movement. The first one is a continuous and faster means of circulation through a glass elevator that provides a view to different spaces, but does not have access to all of them. Another experience is through a ramp that reaches the following level. While ascending the ramp, the columns provide structural elements to grab onto for maintaining balance. The next level will be skipped if the elevator has been chosen as a way of ascending the building. The columns have now become partitions and set the boundary between inside and outside. These partitions intensify the experience by creating a light and shadow effect. As they are placed evenly and rhythmically, they suggest calmness and alert movement. Looking around, the glass floor of the next level provides a visual cue of the water. Moving forward, the bottom of the pool becomes visible. On this level, the ramp or the climbing surface is now interpreted as a slide. When the visitor is descending on the surface, she senses a decrease in her speed of movement until realizing the change in the rhythm of columns. As these repetitive elements get further apart, the body misinterprets its own speed of movement. In this case, the columns are now visual elements to exaggerate the sense of movement. The same wooden elements have been interpreted as visual elements to exaggerate or suppress the sense of movement, vertical elements to establish a boundary between inside and outside, and also horizontal elements for the flooring of the next level. There are two ways to reach the pool. In both ways, the visitor has to move through a series of uneven marble steps, using the eyes and bodily sensations. On one side, the subject places her bare foot on the wooden planks and feels the warmth of the sunlight before feeling the cold marble. The marble steps are uneven and interrupted. Nothing distracts the body from the conscious and careful movement of its feet on the steps. As the explorer continues, she reaches the pool. There's tension between inside and outside, as the low walls and transparent surfaces provide views to both inside and outside. The skin feels the spatial contrast that exists between the softness of the water and the textured feeling of marble. During the winter, the pool acts as a hot tub, and the drastic temperature difference between the cold weather and the hot water triggers the sense of thermoception. Looking down, the body senses perilousness when the eye meets the glass floor and acknowledges the elevation of its location. As one pays closer attention, the ambiguity of the indoor-outdoor relationship increases, since half of the glass floor has a view of the interior and the other half has a view of the exterior, divided by a concrete wall. As one looks up from the pool, the angled mirror is visible through the glazed roof, covering half of the pool. The mirror provides a visual cue to the level above, the fair room, as well as the pool itself. The eye also perceives the flowing water on the top level and questions the connection between the water splashing into the pool with the one above. The immersion of the body in the water not only distorts the way the eyes perceive space, but also it disconnects the senses from the totality of space by blocking out the sun, the sound, the air, the light, and the mind. The return back from abstraction to the state of awareness requires an exaggerated activation of the senses. The next level is divided into two sections. The first section is accessible only by means of the ramp from the previous level, and the second section can be reached using the stairs. The two parts have no access to each other. Also, the first section does not have access to the next level, and one has to go back to the previous level and take the stairs to reach the following level. If the ramp is taken, the unstable floor impacts the sense of balance drastically. One has to pause constantly to maintain her balance and continue as she feels stable. It can be considered a painful experience or a pleasant one, depending on how one feels in space. As one feels stable enough to look up, the flowing water once again becomes visible. The tension between inside and outside intensifies the experience. Stepping off the unstable floor, the softness of fur exaggerates the feeling of comfort as it immediately follows a high level of discomfort. The mirror reflects an image of the pool to dislocate and attract people visually. If one has already experienced the pool, she feels dislocated, since the reflection is higher in space than the location of the body. If one has not experienced the pool, then the reflection attracts the explorer to find the location of the pool. Moving forward in the fur room, the observer can now have a view of the pool. Getting off the elevator, one now enters the next level, a very compressed space that requires bending of the body or some different way of moving on one side due to the low ceiling. Concrete surfaces invite the visitor to touch and experience the texture. As one takes the next few steps, she enters the expansive room. The effect of light on the textured concrete animates the space during the day. The space is interpreted as a pure mass of shadow, and the strips of light hollow out the darkness. The spaciousness of the room and the play of light encourages the individual to linger in the space. Stepping onto the floor covered with filled stone, one becomes conscious of the drastic change in materiality. As she traverses the stepstones on the water, the body's equilibrium and balance are stimulated and hence slow down the motion and magnify actions in space. The stream of flowing water and its melodic sound landing on the angled mirror and eventually in the pool lures one towards the edge. The physical model showcases the hapticity of some of these spaces. Due to the present situation, you will be watching a video walkthrough of the modeled spaces. Not working. The journey never comes to an end. The subject can explore spaces that have not been experienced while descending the building. The level of complexity of this machine allows for diverse experiential journeys, both moving upwards and downwards. Besides, the order in which the spaces are encountered varies the experience. Even though the same path can be taken twice, the way the body interacts with the affordances will be different every time. The journey can be uncomfortable, ambiguous, and sometimes even risky. It might require us to break out of our regular habits and therefore demands our conscious awareness. It is in the state of awareness that one encounters unexpected opportunities and experiences the totality of space. Our body is an essential dimension of our humanity, since it is a necessary instrument for our perception, thoughts, and actions. In order to educate and enrich our lived humanistic experience, architectural space in which our actions and movements take place can possibly cultivate improved somatic awareness. The answer is not to fill in the atmosphere of our everyday lives with interruptions and obstacles, or to give attention to all of our bodily actions. The answer is to take into consideration the opportunities that the semesthetic senses embody and to incorporate them in everyday architecture as much as possible to augment the experienced atmosphere. The challenge ahead is to keep a balance between implying these opportunities and maintaining a functional space for everyday use. Thank you.
Thank you, Nona.
Thank you, Nona. Could I share the video which Nona prepared? I have it playing. It can be played, right?
That would be great.
Just a moment. Yes,
let's
I
do
will
that.
share my screen.
Leo, would you be able to share the sound as well?
Yes, just a moment.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Nona.
Thank you.
So welcome to our two guests. We're delighted to have you. Thank you for coming, Lisa and Timur. If you're okay with that, I'd suggest that you start, because that would be fresh comment on the students' work.
Sure, I could begin. Thank you, Nona. And Nona, if you would like to keep sharing your screen, it could be useful because we might refer to some drawings that you'll want to scroll back and forth to on your presentation. So first I'll say that I read the document, and thank you very much for providing it in advance. I'd say the first part of the document is very impressive, with the breadth of research that you've done and the skill and clarity with which you put it together. A really nice range of resources in understanding the many senses of the body. I do have a couple questions, in mainly having to do with your decisions for how you translated that research into a design process and your decisions for framing what you ended up designing. I guess maybe the first question has to do with the citing of the design proposition. I mean, so much of what you were researching in the first part of your document is about situating the body, not just in the physical limitations of its profile, but in all of its abilities to act upon and to perceive the world. And architecture is arguably very similar in that it doesn't just exist with the perimeter of its exterior wall or the limits of its footprint, but it participates in a world. And with your work, which is very compelling in how you've built up the pieces, it seems to be somewhat placeless. Now, maybe I'm mistaken about that, but could you speak to how your decisions about the place of this particular work, or if it's a hypothetical place?
It is a hypothetical place. The site and the program, it was completely suppressed because I want to focus on the interior experience of architecture and possibly translating those into everyday architecture. So the location wasn't a key point in my exploration because I was hoping to achieve spaces that can be translated into all different spaces. That's why site and program weren't a focus for me.
Yeah, and I guess that, I mean, that can be a useful way. Like sometimes it's very helpful to bracket some things out in order to create an intensity in one area of investigation. But maybe the richness of your project is to realize the many, many ways in which the body apprehends the world and exists in the world. And I think that's its real strength. So it could be that by making that decision to bracket certain things out, there's also some of the richness of your project, which then is not tapped into as much. So for instance, one part of your document, you went through a very nice series of precedents where movement through the building was important. And I was struck by the number of libraries that were in your study. There is also ritual spaces, and then there was the Bath Project by Peter Sumter. But in the libraries especially, it's a very interesting case because it would be difficult to extract the body's experience from those spaces from the, you know, the kind of desire to have a social experience, which brings up the issue of the social body. You're rarely in a library alone. There are many, many other people in there for many diverse reasons. So it's a way to experience the social body of the city. And then there's times where you're going to study or read as an individual, where the study carrel or the personal quiet space becomes important, but then you're also there to collaborate, where the group space becomes important. So, you know, we could refer to some of those things as program, but I think you could invent new terms to think about the body's relationship to what it's doing, to how you're motivated, and the degrees to which you're engaging social situations, which are multiple bodies together doing things. So I guess maybe since it was a decision of yours to bracket out sort of program issues and some site issues, do you have thoughts about how you could bring those back in, or the sorts of programs or sites that your strategy could lead to?
Bringing in social interactions into this discussion, it will, for me personally, I decided to not pursue program at all, because at some point I was trying to apply these into specific programs, and each program, depending on the nature of the program, they require different things, as you said, social settings and how people encounter with different things. So they brought in different requirements into the project that kind of took away from the point that I was trying to prove throughout my thesis, and to show the possibilities that exist. Whereas if this is taken into a social, well, if you take this into a residential building as opposed to a social setting, the way you use these spaces will be completely different. For example, the library, the Toronto Reference Library, the way the staircases, moving through the building disorients the body constantly. Whereas if you want to have that staircase in a residential building, it will completely have a different characteristics. It can still do the same thing, but it will be very different. So I guess my decision for not including program into this was solely because those characteristics will at some point make a big influence into design decisions. And I guess that's why I made that decision.
Okay, well, I can let someone else speak, and I might jump in a bit more.
Great, thank you very much. Timur, would you like to go ahead?
Sure, thanks. I hope my voice is clear. These
Yes, that's very good.
Great. And in a way, I think I might come back to some of, and thank you, Nona, for your work. I think I'll probably end up coming back to Lisa's opening points, really on citing and program. But really starting my question, I guess, on the question of light and how it's treated in the project. It's funny, sometimes, despite the strong research, I found some of the categorizations, I just say I didn't necessarily agree with them, that light is in fact intangible, you know.
Yeah.
Some of the early examples you showed, the one slide that had the Terrell, the Ando and the Val's baths together, that have obviously a 0 or let's say a 5 or 10% glazing to solid ratio, right, in terms of their treatment of light, that they really rely on opacity and darkness really to communicate the weight and the tangibility and the physicality of light, you know, right? So in a way that brings me back to the general treatment of light. I think you have obviously with the brick room and the concrete room, you're playing with contrast. Although for me, sometimes the transition from one to another is very jarring. You know, I think to this space in Japan, anecdotally, I've heard about it. It's the Deo Ando project. Inside a very dark cave, you need to follow kind of hold on to a rope to make your way inside. It's so dark, and then you kind of have to sit there for 20 minutes, and it takes that long for the eyes to adjust, and then you just see like a single trickle of light coming down. You know, so it's also a way to temper the time aspects. But it seems to me that I guess I'm questioning. I'd like to ask you, I suppose,
Yeah.
you know, what led to this glass to solid ratio in the overall building of, let's say, 50-50 or 60-40 or something like that, right? As opposed to some of these other examples that rely much more on a kind of underlying opacity. And this does bring me back to some of the siting questions, namely orientation. I mean, Lisa brought up siting. For me, it's also, you know, is it an urban landscape or is it Fogo Island? I don't know, but in terms of south, north, east, west, and understanding, you know, which latitude you're at, et cetera, I think that's really where the exterior building envelope comes into play. You know, that you have a very heavy use, and especially in the atrium spaces and throughout, of exterior glazing, and but it's always kind of rendered in the background as a very big blank surface, as opposed to something maybe that upon which various treatments can be put on, from fritting to frosting to patterning to you name it, to staining, to there's many ways in which that glazing, that exterior envelope glazing, can be a kind of a mediating and flexible component in this as well. So maybe you can just just answer maybe the question about light and
Yeah.
whether for you it's tangible, intangible. It's kind of all related, I suppose.
Yeah. One thing I want to clarify, even though my project doesn't have a site, I located it in Toronto to capture the lighting. So it's not a very ambiguous setting. So the lightings are captured, even in the render that I show the pool during the winter and during the summer, the angle of light is captured properly. I located it in Toronto so I can get the accurate lighting for all the renderings in relation to one another. But in terms of the site, as I said again, there were too many distractions. I can't call them distractions, but outside factors that weren't my focus, which the focus I was going for was the perception of the interior space and how these qualities can affect that. Whereas, well, of course, sunlight has a big impact on the way you feel in space and other things, but having a specific site and program wasn't really the focus, because I was hoping to achieve something that can be applied in different locations and in different settings, hopefully. That, well, of course, the fixed conditions of the site will be different for wherever you decide to put this project or wherever you decide to apply these settings. But I was hoping to achieve a system or a machine that explores those possibilities, and these possibilities can be taken and applied to different programs, different sites, and different conditions.
Okay, thank you.
I hope I answered your question.
I think you did in large part. I guess my question is really the exterior envelope as part of this machine, as another module in this machine, specifically the interface between inside and outside.
Yeah, so I never thought about the exterior envelope as much, because the main focus was interior. So whatever happens in the exterior is as a result of the experience that I was trying to achieve in the inside of the building.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Garth, would you like to join in and comment or ask any questions? Garth? No. Marco, maybe? Ah, my voice.
Yeah, okay.
Garth, okay, God, you're unmuted.
Yeah, I've unmuted myself. I guess just briefly, primarily this has been an interior investigation, but I have to say, as I was kind of looking at it, I was curious if this could also be applied to the exterior environment. That the fact that it's siteless, this is primarily about interior spatiality. Both other comments have had to do with site, and I think the reality is that many of these formulae or sequences could be applied to the exterior of a building or urban condition. It sort of struck me for a minute that in some ways there's a little bit of a pattern, the thinking behind a pattern language or townscape, one in interior, significantly interior patterns that in the case of a pattern language, is a lot of it's cultural, but it's perceptual. And townscape, it's also perception. That I do think that some of these, some of the missing exploration, if there is one, or the next step would be, how do you apply this to the site? Because I think it also does apply. So that's kind of the comment that struck me, or came to me.
Do you want to contribute anything, Nona? Or
I think, I guess if I was going to take the next step and actually take these possibilities and imply them, then I would want to pick different sites as opposed to just one, and see how these would how they would be different in different locations and in relation to different programs and social settings. I think that would be, if I were to continue working on this project, that would be the next step for sure. I don't think doing one site and one program would do justice to the project. So if I were to continue, I would pick completely different sites and programs to explore even more in terms of what these possibilities would be.
okay, thank you. Marco, would you like to provide some feedback?
Sure. Just to respond to some of this discussion about site and so forth. One of the ways this project has been talked about from the beginning, as Nona mentioned, is this idea of this kind of experiential machine. And the way I've understood it has always been on the basis that this was a way of establishing a kind of toolkit that could then be generalizable or applicable to specific architectural projects, which would have program, which would have site, et cetera. And that, as you know, as Lisa put it, this was an effort to bracket out some of the other forces at work, which are always very complicated and multivalent, in order to concentrate on a particular set of conditions and issues. That obviously has its limitations, but it also has the advantage of as we said, bracketing the project. It's interesting because earlier today, I sat in on another presentation which could have used more bracketing, because it ended up having to deal with all kinds of issues that were completely external to the thesis. But because of the nature of the project that was defined and the way it was programmatically set up and the site conditions that it had to deal with, the kernel of the thesis was somewhat diluted because there was all this other stuff to deal with. So one kind of, you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't kind of thing, right? So in a sense, I think there is this feeling, and I often resist projects that are too focused on a specific issue, because I think they tend to be very, very limited in their pursuits. But I think there's enough complexity just in this series of spaces that I think it carries the kind of, the substance of the thesis that Nona was pursuing. It is definitely a very interior project. There's no question about that. And I think that there is certainly the possibility, even with that in mind, that the articulation of the exterior could be further developed in relation, specifically, as Nona put it, in relation to the desired interior effects, right? I mean, there's a lot that could still happen on that envelope that has everything to do with the internal experience, the interior experience. So that's, I think another level of investigation that if this project were to continue, that would probably be the next kind of significant investigation to undertake. I think that the extreme nature of some of these spaces is obviously one that you would say, well, when I translate this into a real quote unquote project, am I really going to have a fur room? Well, maybe not. But what are some of the lessons learned from this, right? Like, what are some of the principles that you take from this project? And if we start to abstract some of those ideas, well, what does fur mean in an architectural setting? Is it about warmth? Is it about softness? Is it about comfort? So you can start to extrapolate abstract qualities that come out of some of these very literal representations that can then start to inform particular kinds of environments. And I think that's where the value of this kind of investigation really starts to show itself.
Great, thank you very much. So thank you very much, Nona. We'll have another round. I'll just add a couple of comments, and then depending on time, we can have another round of comments. So I really also enjoyed the research work you've done. I think it's thorough. The precedents are very interesting, and the way you have broken down all of these different haptic experiences is interesting. I think you speak about this conceptual framework at the end of your document, and it would be really nice to come back to it towards the end. So, because you say that you can apply this in different contexts, just to summarize, what is this framework? You go through it thoroughly through your thesis, but maybe at in the conclusion, come back to that framework and its applicability based on all of these questions that are asked about sight. I think we have a sense, we clearly sense the experiences that you are sharing with us. And one aspect that could be really interesting, especially since we're speaking about those interior-exterior relationship, is to further develop the section to show whether it's a framework that you're working with in a different sense than the previous framework that I was referring to, whether you have a grid system in which you are going to implement these rooms, or whether the materiality of these rooms is dictating the outside. For example, if it's the brick, you look at the element of the brick and how it creates this interior, and whether is that the material that is also the structural material that is related to concrete maybe sometimes, or steel somewhere else. So I think there's very interesting work here. I really enjoyed the reading and the exploration. So these are some of my comments. So who wants to ask another question? Would you like? Yes, go ahead, please, Lisa.
Sure. I'll just build on your point about the geometry of the section and going to the module of the cube. I think, you know, given the decision to focus on the interior, one could maybe elaborate more on the spatial generation, like the units that you use to build up the architecture, the originary geometric operations that you use to generate the space. So you began with a grid, a cube, a 3 by 3 by 3 meter cube. And I guess one could question that decision. You know, your reasons for that might be a kind of neutrality. But given the very sensuous nature of your interests, you know, that decision could have been different, and it might have led to different places. But then, even though you began with that very Cartesian orthogonal system of grid work, what you ended up with, and we see it on the image that you have on the screen right now, is this very kind of murky, overlapping, distorted spatial configuration, reflected through the space and through the water. And I guess it might be interesting to see what architectural, spatially tectonic lessons could be extracted from that imagery you arrived at the end, which seems to be a bit more biological and amorphic, like its shape is not fixed, it's not determined. It certainly isn't any longer a 3 by 3 by 3 meter cube. And thinking about it in relationship of the body, and so what you arrived at in terms of the imagery and the spatial complexity could become the beginning point, the generative principle for an architecture. And it would be interesting to see how you could make use of that in future propositions. And just to give a sort of historical reference about that, since the beginning of your paper was looking at the history of representation and theories of the body and how they intersect architecture, it would be like the difference between Michelangelo's approach to drawing the body and Albrecht Dürer, who begins by understanding the body in a cube and draws a square around everything. It's very geometricized. And Michelangelo apparently critiqued Dürer's drawings as all of his people were stiff as boards because they were all abiding by this geometry. And Michelangelo began in a very different, more serpentine way of understanding the body. So like if you were to redo this project, or if going forward in your next project, if you began with where you ended up in this project, how could that be used as a generator of space?
That's great. Thank you so much. Did you want to respond anything, or you'll take it?
No, I think all the comments are very valid and useful for moving forward.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Okay. Timur, would you like to add anything?
Yes, yes, please. Nona, I just want to say I really, appreciate the range of questions that you're answering. Excuse me, not answering. I don't think any thesis can answer questions, but as my own thesis supervisor put it, the thesis is about setting up the questions that you're going to be kind of working on for the rest of your career. And Derek Brevington, my thesis supervisor, told me that once. And I think you've set up a lot of really interesting questions to continue to pursue. I guess my second question is about, I think, the role of technology and to what extent you embrace it in the let's call it trajectory of this work. Yeah, I mean, I don't think the next step necessarily. I'd love to see this one day applied to kind of modular construction. This type of hyper sensorial approach. Approach in a modular way, I find very, very interesting. But I think there's maybe some steps along the way, and one of those might have to do with visualizing this or seeing this as a kind of installation, potentially immersive technology-based 4D technology. I mean, I'm captivated by the thesis based on some video work, but mostly still imagery. When this whole thing is really about movement and things like that. So before going from A to Z, Z being modular construction and your vision being built all over the world, there's this intermediate step, I think, which is interesting, and gaming companies, interestingly enough, are doing that now. I mean, they're introducing haptic technology from sound technology embedded into chairs to a mouse with haptic feedback, keyboards, you name it, to kind of create a hyper real sense, I suppose, of more broader sense of atmospherics in a virtual environment. Yeah. Obviously, you use complex software, et cetera, to create these engaging visuals and this narrative. So what's the next step, I guess, for this project from a technological, or let's call it immersive technology standpoint? If there is one, it doesn't have to be.
I don't think I have thought about that, but making a video, at one point during the design research, I have explored videos and making videos and walking through all these spaces that I designed at one point. So I had a video during my presentation. It was an experiential video. I have pictures of it in my document, but I also talked about at one point making a VR, so like people could actually look around different spaces, but I was not very familiar with the software, so I realized maybe I don't have, in terms of the time limit that I had, I couldn't start a new program that I wasn't familiar with. That's why I didn't go that route. But in terms of the future of the project, I don't think I thought about it that way, but that's for sure something to think about. Because it's interesting you say that one of my friends actually referred to this project as something very similar to video games. So it's interesting that you brought that comment up. So I think that's something to think about.
I think it's an interesting thing to consider. I mean, VR is one route. I mean, James Turrell relied on simple projectors in a black box environment, but I think there's and maybe the Stephen Hall project that you showed as well, relied on a certain amount of lighting and within a kind of a more of a black box type of environment. So it doesn't necessarily need to be with VR goggles. It can be within a black box environment where a more condensed narrative can be told, or your story can kind of unfold visually, in more and more immersive ways.
Yeah.
Great, thank you very much. Garth, would you like to add to the second round?
I guess just to say that for me, when I look at this and the examples that you've given, that this toolkit I think is really intended for real physical built buildings. Yeah, yes, it could become a video game, but the exploration here and your reference sources, Louis Kahn, Peter Zumthor, these are architects for whom materials and space and the atmospherics of environments are supremely important. This is not an exploration about entertainments. This is an exploration about making meaningful spaces and environments that involve the body in a real way, not a virtual way. That's my understanding of this, and that to me is what I find interesting, because this is, for a couple of your patterns. The one where either referencing Carlos Scarpa or a Japanese garden where you have to walk very carefully because otherwise you risk injuring yourself. It's a very real physical experience that we're rarely given in buildings. So again, that's the kind of experience that I get out of this, that I would say makes it useful for when you actually start doing buildings and you start doing interiors, to actually start taking these lessons and seeing if you can actually use them in the making of those spaces.
Okay, that's a great comment. Nona, I think we're coming close to the end. So what I suggest is that if you have any question, Nona, for us here. No, if anyone,
all the comments, thank you.
Okay, if anyone else has a comment, and I'd suggest that Marco wraps up with a final comment. But if anyone else before Marco has a final comment.
It was a pleasure, Nona. Congratulations.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Pleasure working with you.
Okay, so Marco, I'll let you wrap up. I think no one else has a comment.
Okay, couple of things. One, I just wanted to come back to the question of site. Even though there isn't a specific site, there was a question about, is it urban? Is it, out in the field? What is it? And I think, some of these things remain unspoken, but looking at the form, the axonometric form that's on the screen right now, given its kind of geometric boundedness, given its verticality, it reads pretty clearly as an urban form. So I think it's interesting to be self-aware of these things, even if there isn't a specific intentionality, like a conscious intention behind it. It obviously, to me, has emerged as an urban type. So I think that's something to just keep in mind as you're developing your work. Always be aware of what assumptions you're making, even when those assumptions aren't necessarily explicit, right? And I think one of the interesting things that comes out of this geometric, very clear kind of geometric definition, and then the more amorphous interior, is that emerges as another one of your binaries, right? A lot of this has had to do with the idea that the experience is much more intensified when you're dealing with sharp contrasts, and this is just another instance of that, as I would read it. So I just wanted to come back to that particular discussion. In more general terms, I think you've done just a crazy amount of work over the course of the year. I mean, there's so much that isn't even represented in this presentation. And I think that it speaks to your process, that there was, very kind of intensive and methodical process that got you here. I agree with Garth that ultimately this is about creating a toolkit for application in actual material architecture. I find it interesting, though, that the water became such an important component of this, when we don't normally think of that as an architectural material. Obviously, we use water a lot, and it's a wonderful material to work with. You've used it in a very unconventional way in this particular project, but I think it does raise some interesting questions about, as Taimur raised, the questions of light, questions of water, questions of other aspects of spatial experience that we don't normally associate with construction materials, and what those offer to us, so that the building itself may be somewhat conventional in terms of its materiality and geometry, but the introduction of some other element can really transform that in pretty powerful ways. You know, I would echo Garth's comments. It's a real pleasure to work on this with you. It's come a really long way. And I know that there was, it was a difficult project to start because of the kind of strange nature of the project. You didn't have a program, you didn't have a site. Where do you dig in? It's come a very long way. So well done.
Thank you, Marco, for everything. Thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
So thank you very much to external reviewers, Lisa Landrum from the University of Manitoba and Timur Bala from the School of Interior Design and the Axia Design Associates. Thank you very much, Garth, Marco, and Nona, especially for your final review. And you'll have news from Marco when we finish to have a discussion.
Sure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, for your
quick
Thank you.
question. Do I need to stay on, or is
Yes, please stay on. Yeah.
So I leave.
So Nona, you leave, and then I will contact you on a separate call once we're done.
Sure.
Okay.
I just have to figure out how.
Okay, I put her in the waiting room.
Oh, you did? Okay.
Yes. So I'm stopping live